I noticed it the moment I picked up the card, before I even read the words, because no one would meet my eyes. The ballroom was glowing in that soft amber light hotels use to make everything feel warm, celebratory, important, but the air around me felt different, like I had stepped into a photograph I didn't belong in. My son's 20th anniversary dinner was exactly the kind of event I used to plan myself, round tables dressed in ivory linen, crystal glasses catching the light, a string quartet playing something gentle in the corner. I stood at the entrance for a second longer than I should have, smoothing the sleeve of my navy dress, telling myself I was imagining things. Then I looked down. Temporary guest only. The words were printed in elegant script, the kind you'd expect to see on a wedding invitation, not something meant to quietly erase a person from her own family. I felt the weight of the card between my fingers, lighter than paper should be. I smiled. Not because it was funny, and not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I understood it too well. "Mrs. Carter," the young hostess said, her voice polite but uncertain. "This way, please." I followed her across the room, heels clicking softly against the polished floor, past tables filled with people who had watched my son grow up, people who had once sat in my kitchen and called me by my first name. Tonight, they nodded at me like I was an acquaintance. Not one of them said, "Evelyn, you look beautiful." Not one of them stood up. My seat was at the edge of the room, not quite hidden, but far enough that no one would have to turn their head to see me. I placed the card in front of me carefully, turning it just slightly so the words faced inward. No need to make anyone uncomfortable. Across the room, I saw Daniel. My son. He was laughing at something his wife had said, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back like he used to do when he was trying to be charming. Sophia looked radiant, of course. She always did at events like this. Her dress caught the light every time she moved, and people leaned in when she spoke, as if she carried the center of the room with her. For a moment, I remembered a different anniversary dinner. Their 10th. I had hosted it at my home. I remembered arranging the flowers myself, tasting the sauce before the caterer arrived, making sure every detail felt perfect. I had stood in the doorway that night, watching them greet their guests, and I had felt proud. Not of the party, but of the life we had built together. I blinked, and the memory dissolved. A server approached my table, hesitating just slightly before speaking. "Ma'am, are you at the Carter party?" I looked up at him, at the uncertainty in his expression, and I realized something had already shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. "Yes," I said gently. "I am." He nodded, but there was something in the way he walked away, like he wasn't entirely convinced. I picked up my water glass, noticing how steady my hand was. That surprised me. I had expected something else. Anger, maybe. Or embarrassment. But instead, there was only clarity. I glanced down at the card again. Temporary guest only. I traced the edge of it with my fingertip, then set it back in place. Across the room, Sophia leaned in to whisper something to Daniel, and they both smiled. I smiled too, because for the first time that evening, I understood exactly what kind of night this was going to be. And more importantly, I understood something they didn't. Nothing about me had ever been temporary. I sat there long enough for the music to settle into the background, long enough for the laughter around the room to form a pattern I could follow without needing to look up. It was a familiar rhythm, the kind that belongs to people who feel comfortable, who know exactly where they stand in a room like this. I used to recognize that feeling. I used to create it. A woman at the next table leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand, her eyes flicking briefly in my direction before returning to her glass of wine. I did not need to hear the words. I had lived long enough to understand the language of glances. Across the room, Sophia lifted her champagne flute and tapped it lightly with a fork. The sound was soft, but it carried. Conversations faded. Chairs shifted. Daniel turned toward her immediately, his attention fixed in a way that felt practiced, automatic. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her voice smooth, warm, perfectly measured. She had always known how to speak in rooms like this. It means so much to celebrate this milestone surrounded by the people who matter most to us. There was a gentle ripple of agreement, nods, smiles, the quiet murmur of approval. I listened carefully to the way she chose her words. People who matter most. It was a simple phrase. Inclusive on the surface. Precise underneath. My gaze drifted to Daniel. For a brief second, his eyes moved across the room and landed near my table, not quite on me, but close enough that I could see the hesitation. Then he looked away. That small movement told me more than anything he could have said. A server returned with a tray of plated salads, placing one in front of me with a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Enjoy your evening," he said, as though he was not entirely sure I belonged to it. I nodded, thanking him quietly, noticing again how steady my voice remained. I picked up my fork and adjusted the napkin in my lap, aligning it with the edge of the table as I had done at hundreds of dinners before. Habits like that do not disappear. They stay with you, even when everything else shifts. I took a small bite, though I could not have told you what it tasted like. My attention was elsewhere, moving slowly across the room, collecting details. The seating arrangement. The way certain guests were positioned closer to the center, to Sophia, to Daniel. The empty chair at the table nearest the head, the one that should have been mine if things had followed the natural order of a family. Instead, I was placed here, at the margin, where observation becomes easier than participation. It was not an accident. That was the part that settled quietly into place inside me. This was not a joke that had gone too far. Not a misunderstanding. It had been arranged, printed, placed, and presented with intention. Temporary guest only. The phrase echoed again, not with pain this time, but with a kind of clarity that felt almost calm. I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip, letting the coolness steady the moment. At the front of the room, Sophia laughed lightly at something Daniel said, her hand resting on his arm as if to anchor him there, at her side, at the center she had created. I watched them for a moment, then lowered my gaze back to the card. I turned it slightly again, just enough that I could read it without anyone else noticing. Temporary. The word lingered, but it no longer felt like a label. It felt like a test. And as I sat there, listening to the music, watching the room move around me, I realized something else with a quiet certainty. They were waiting to see how I would react. Whether I would question it. Whether I would make a scene. Whether I would prove them right about the role they had assigned me. I placed the card flat against the table and folded my hands gently over it, covering the words completely. Let them watch. Let them wonder. I had spent a lifetime learning when to speak and when to remain still. Tonight, stillness would tell me everything I needed to know. I did not realize how quiet a room could feel until everyone in it was speaking at once. The conversations rose and fell like soft waves, polite laughter layered over the clinking of silverware and glass, but none of it reached me in the way it should have. It was as if I were sitting behind a pane of glass, watching a celebration that I had once belonged to but could no longer enter. I kept my hands folded over the card, not out of embarrassment, but because I had already learned something important. When people want you to notice something, they will make sure you see it. When they want you to react, they will leave just enough space for you to do so. I was not going to give them that space. "Evelyn," a voice said gently from my left. I turned to see Margaret Lewis standing beside my table, her expression caught somewhere between concern and caution. We had known each other for over 20 years. She had attended every holiday dinner I hosted, had once told me my dining room felt more like a home than her own. Tonight, she hesitated before sitting down. "I did not realize you were seated here," she said, lowering herself into the empty chair across from me without waiting for an invitation. I offered her a small smile. "Neither did I replied softly. She glanced at my hands, at the way they rested over the place card, and for a brief second, I considered moving them. Instead, I left them exactly where they were. If she wanted to know, she would ask. Margaret had always been perceptive. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Is everything all right?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. Not curiosity. Not gossip. Something closer to recognition. I held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Of course," I said. "It is a lovely evening." She studied me, searching for something in my expression, something I did not offer. After a moment, she leaned back, though her eyes did not lose that quiet awareness. "It is," she agreed, though her tone suggested she was not convinced. A few tables away, Sophia was moving from guest to guest, placing a hand on shoulders, leaning in just enough to make each person feel seen. I watched the pattern of it, the careful distribution of attention, the way she shaped the room without ever appearing to control it. When she finally approached our side of the ballroom, her pace slowed almost imperceptibly. She greeted Margaret first. "I am so glad you could make it," she said warmly, her smile bright and effortless. Then her eyes shifted to me. "Just for a second." "Evelyn," she added, the name spoken with polite distance, as though it belonged to someone she had not expected to see. I inclined my head slightly. "Sophia," I replied, matching her tone exactly. There was a pause. Brief. Measured. Long enough for both of us to understand what had not been said. Her gaze flickered toward my hands, toward the place where the card lay hidden beneath them. Something unreadable passed through her expression, then it was gone. "Enjoy the evening," she said lightly, already turning away before I could respond. I watched her walk back toward the center of the room, her presence drawing attention the way light draws the eye. Margaret let out a quiet breath beside me. "That felt deliberate," she murmured. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I lifted my hands just enough to adjust the card beneath them, straightening it so it aligned perfectly with the edge of the table. Then I placed my hands back down, calm and steady. "Most things are," I said at last. Margaret followed the movement, her eyes catching the edge of the words before I covered them again. Her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. "Understanding." Then something sharper. "Evelyn," she began, her voice low, but I shook my head almost imperceptibly. "Not now. Not here." She stopped, reading the signal the way she always had. Across the room, Daniel raised his glass, calling for a toast. The room quieted again, all attention turning toward him. I turned as well, my posture straight, my expression composed. If they had planned this evening as a test, then they had already made their first mistake. They believed they were the only ones observing. They believed I was simply sitting here, waiting to be acknowledged or dismissed. They did not understand that I had spent the entire night watching, listening, remembering. And once you begin to see things clearly, it becomes very difficult to unsee them. Daniel's voice carried easily across the room, confident and warm in a way that would have made anyone believe this was a perfect evening, the kind of celebration people would remember fondly years from now. He spoke about commitment, about partnership, about building a life together over 2 decades, and the guests responded exactly as expected, with soft laughter at the right moments and appreciative nods at the familiar phrases. I listened carefully, not to the words themselves, but to the spaces between them. That is where truth tends to settle. When he mentioned gratitude, his eyes moved across the tables again, slower this time, and for a fraction of a second they landed directly on me. There was something there, something uncertain, almost searching, as if he was trying to measure whether I would disrupt the version of the evening he was presenting. I held his gaze without expression, then lifted my glass slightly in acknowledgement, nothing more. The gesture was small, controlled, and it gave him exactly what he needed. Permission to continue. He looked away first. As the applause began, polite and sustained, I felt a memory rise quietly to the surface, uninvited but clear. It was not from this room, but from another evening years ago, when Daniel had stood in my kitchen, barely tall enough to reach the counter, asking me if I thought he would ever have a family of his own. I had smiled then, the way mothers do when they already know the answer, and told him he would build something strong, something lasting. Back then, I believed that strength came from closeness, from loyalty, from the invisible threads that hold people together over time. Tonight, I saw those threads differently. Not broken, just rearranged. The applause faded, replaced by the soft return of conversation, and servers began clearing plates with quiet efficiency. Margaret leaned closer again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You hosted their 10th anniversary, did you not?" she asked. I nodded once. "At your home?" "Yes," I said, the memory settling more firmly now. I could see it as clearly as if I were standing there again. The long dining table, extended to its full length. the candles placed exactly 2 feet apart. The way Daniel had stood at the head of the table that night, proud but slightly nervous, while I moved through the room making sure everything felt seamless. I had not sat down for more than a few minutes that entire evening. There had always been something to adjust, someone to greet, a detail to perfect. That had been my role. Not temporary. Foundational. I returned my attention to the present, to the room that now felt carefully curated in a way that excluded me without ever stating it directly. That was the difference. Before, I had been the one arranging the details. Now, I was one of them. Sophia's voice rose again from across the room, lighter this time, directing the next part of the evening. A slideshow, she explained, capturing 20 years of memories. The lights dimmed slightly, and a large screen at the front flickered to life. Photographs began to appear one by one. Their wedding day, vacations, birthdays, milestones carefully selected and displayed in a sequence that told a story. I watched each image with quiet attention, noting not just what was included, but what was not. There were pictures from holidays I had hosted, events I had organized, moments I knew intimately. In those, I appeared only at the edges, if at all. In some, I was absent entirely. Not because I had not been there, but because the frame had been chosen differently. Cropped. Refocused. Adjusted. Margaret noticed it too. I could feel the shift in her posture beside me, the subtle tightening of her expression as she followed the progression of images. "That is selective," she murmured. I did not respond. There was no need. The evidence was unfolding on its own, quietly, publicly, without confrontation. I reached for my water again, taking a slow sip as another photograph appeared, this one from a holiday dinner I remembered vividly. I had stood just outside the frame, holding a tray, waiting for the photographer to finish so I could bring out dessert. In the version on the screen, the tray was gone. So was I. I set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, just as I had aligned everything else tonight. Patterns reveal themselves when you look long enough. And once you see the pattern, you begin to understand the intention behind it. This evening was not just about celebration. It was about narrative. About deciding who belonged at the center of the story, and who could be quietly moved to the margins. I folded my hands again, resting them lightly on the table, and allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to return. They had taken great care in shaping this version of events. What they had not considered was how much I already knew about the original. The room dimmed further as the final image faded from the screen, and for a moment there was a soft pause, the kind that usually follows something meaningful, something that settles into people before they respond. Then the applause came, warm and approving, filling the space with the exact reaction the evening had been designed to produce. I joined in, my hands moving lightly, the sound deliberate but measured, matching the rhythm without adding anything to it. Across the room, Sophia inclined her head graciously, accepting the admiration as though it had always belonged to her. Daniel stood beside her, smiling, his posture relaxed now that the hardest part was over. I watched them both, noting the ease that had returned to his shoulders, the confidence in her expression. They believed the narrative had been accepted. They believed the room had seen what they wanted it to see. Margaret did not clap for long. I felt her gaze shift toward me again, searching, questioning, as though she was trying to reconcile what she had just witnessed with what she knew to be true. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "there were entire years missing from that." I turned my head slightly, meeting her eyes. "Not missing," I replied. "Removed." The distinction settled between us, heavier than the word itself. She exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair as if the realization required space. Around us, conversation resumed, louder now, energized by the shared experience, but the tone had changed just enough that I could hear it clearly. The admiration remained, but beneath it, there were small fractures. A question here. A glance there. People notice more than they admit, especially when something feels slightly out of alignment. A man at the next table leaned toward his companion, murmuring something while gesturing subtly toward the screen, now dark. His companion nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than impressed. These were small things. Almost invisible. but they mattered. I reached for my water again, taking a slow sip as I let my attention move across the room with greater focus now. Patterns had already begun to shift. The servers moved with quiet precision, clearing plates, refilling glasses, but one of them paused briefly at my table, his posture different this time. More certain. "Would you like anything else, ma'am?" he asked. His tone had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. I looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly. "No, thank you," I said gently. "Everything is exactly as it should be." He nodded, though something in his expression suggested he was not entirely sure what I meant. That was all right. Understanding does not always come immediately. It builds piece by piece as details begin to connect. Across the room, Sophia was speaking again, outlining the next part of the evening, her voice steady, confident, unaware of the subtle shifts taking place at the edges of her carefully arranged setting. Daniel stood beside her, listening, his attention fixed where it had been all night, but I noticed something new now. A slight delay in his responses. A moment longer before he smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I lowered my gaze to the table once more, to the card still resting beneath my hands. Slowly, I lifted my fingers and turned it over completely, placing it face down against the linen. The words disappeared instantly, as though they had never been there at all. I rested my hands lightly on top of it again, not to hide it this time, but to keep it exactly where I wanted it. Margaret followed the movement, her eyes narrowing slightly as she understood the gesture. "You were not going to say anything," she whispered. It was not a question. I allowed myself a faint smile, one that did not reach my eyes but carried something steadier beneath it. "Not yet," I said. Because there is a moment in every situation like this when speaking too soon gives everything away. When silence, held just long enough, allows the truth to reveal itself without resistance. I had learned that over years of hosting, of observing, of understanding how people behave when they believe they are in control. And tonight, as the room continued to move around me, as the evening unfolded exactly as planned, I could see it clearly. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something they had not prepared for. The music shifted into something softer, a slow instrumental that gave people permission to relax into their chairs, to lean closer to one another, to speak in quieter tones that felt more personal. It was the part of the evening where structure faded and instincts took over. I had always paid attention to this moment. It was where people revealed themselves without realizing it. I adjusted the cuff of my sleeve, smoothing the fabric with a small, practiced motion, and let my gaze drift toward the far end of the room where a familiar figure had just entered. He paused near the doorway, scanning the space with a careful, measured look that did not belong to a guest who was simply arriving late. Howard Blake had always carried himself that way. Observant first, present second. He had been my husband's attorney for over 30 years, and in that time, I had learned to recognize the difference between his social smile and the one he used when he was taking mental notes. Tonight, it was the second one. He moved through the room slowly, acknowledging a few people along the way, but his attention settled on me almost immediately. Not directly. Not obviously. Just enough to confirm that he had seen what he needed to see. I did not raise my hand or call out to him. That would have been unnecessary. Instead, I sat exactly as I had been, my posture straight, my hands resting lightly on the table, allowing him to approach when the moment felt natural. Across the room, Sophia was occupied with a small group near the bar, her laughter carrying just far enough to draw attention without overwhelming the space. Daniel stood beside her, though his focus seemed divided now, his eyes moving more frequently, as if something in the room had shifted in a way he could not quite define. Howard reached my table without announcement, stopping just beside my chair with a quiet presence that did not demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and steady, the same tone he had used in my living room years ago when discussing matters that required precision rather than emotion. I looked up at him, offering a small, composed smile. "Howard," I replied. "You made it." He inclined his head slightly, his eyes taking in the details of the table, the placement of my seat, the distance between me and the center of the room. He did not comment immediately. He never did. Instead, he pulled out the chair beside me and sat down without asking, as though he already understood that permission was not the issue. I was not certain I would be able to attend, he said calmly, though. There was something deliberate in the way he chose his words. But I thought it might be important. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. It usually is, I said. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, recognizing him instantly, her posture straightening with a subtle respect. Mr. Blake, she greeted softly. He acknowledged her with a brief nod before returning his attention to me. I trust the evening has been illuminating, he added, the pause before the final word precise enough to carry meaning without explanation. I allowed a faint smile to return, one that did not soften the expression in my eyes. Very, I said. There was a brief silence between us, not uncomfortable, but measured, as though both of us were aligning our understanding without needing to speak it aloud. Then, almost casually, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and placed a thin envelope on the table beside my hand. He did not slide it toward me. He did not draw attention to it. He simply set it there, as though it belonged among the place settings. I thought you might want to review this when you have a moment, he said quietly. I glanced down at the envelope, recognizing the weight of it before I even touched it. Not physical weight. Something else. Something familiar. I rested my fingers lightly against its edge, not opening it, not yet. Across the room, Sophia turned in our direction, her expression shifting for just a fraction of a second when she noticed who was sitting beside me. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. I lifted my gaze back to Howard, my voice calm, steady, unchanged. You always did have excellent timing, I said. He allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. Timing, he replied, is rarely an accident. I let that settle, my hand still resting lightly on the envelope, my posture unchanged. The room continued to move around us, unaware that something had just shifted beneath the surface. And for the first time that evening, I felt the balance begin to tilt, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone once it started. I did not open the envelope right away. That was the first rule Howard had ever taught me without saying it out loud. Information has weight, and once you unfold it, you cannot pretend you have not seen it. So I left it where it was, resting just beside my hand, as if it were nothing more than another piece of stationery placed there for decoration. But I was aware of it. Every second. The room continued to breathe around me, conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking, laughter flowing a little too easily now that the formalities were over. From a distance, it looked like a successful evening. From where I was sitting, it looked like something else entirely. You are not surprised, Howard said quietly beside me. It was not a question. I let my gaze remain forward, watching as a server adjusted the centerpiece on a nearby table, aligning it carefully as if precision could correct something deeper. No, I replied. Just informed. He nodded once, as though that distinction mattered, because it did. Surprise belongs to people who have not been paying attention. I had been paying attention for a long time. Margaret shifted slightly, her eyes moving between us, sensing the quiet exchange without fully understanding it. She did not ask. That, too, told me something. Across the room, Sophia's attention had changed. It was subtle, but once you notice it, you cannot ignore it. She was still smiling, still moving from group to group, but her glances were no longer random. They were measured, directed, and more than once, they returned to this table. To me. To Howard. Daniel noticed it as well. I could see the way his posture adjusted, the slight tension returning to his shoulders as he followed her line of sight. He said something to her, low and quick, but she only shook her head lightly, dismissing whatever concern he had raised. Confidence. That was what she relied on. The belief that everything had been arranged too carefully to be undone. I lowered my gaze to the envelope again, letting my fingers rest against its edge. The paper was smooth, unmarked, but I knew exactly what kind of document Howard would not bring into a room like this unless it mattered. Not speculation. Not rumor. Something definitive. Something that did not require explanation once it was seen. They think this is about a seat, Margaret whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible. I allowed a small breath to leave me, not quite a laugh, but close enough to carry the same meaning. It always starts with something small, I said. That is how people test boundaries. Howard leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving across the room with the same careful observation he had used for decades in boardrooms and courtrooms. And how do you intend to respond to the test? He asked, his tone neutral, but precise. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached forward and lifted the envelope, turning it once in my hands before setting it back down exactly where it had been. The movement was slow, deliberate, visible to anyone who happened to be watching. And someone was. I did not need to look to know that Sophia's attention had sharpened. Not here, I said finally. Not yet. Because there is a difference between revealing the truth and choosing the moment when it cannot be ignored. This room, with its soft lighting and polite conversations, was designed to absorb discomfort, to smooth it over before it could settle. What I had in front of me deserved something else. Something clearer. I folded my hands again, resting them lightly over the envelope, anchoring it in place. Across the room, Daniel's eyes met mine once more. This time, he did not look away immediately. There was something different in his expression now. Not certainty. Not confidence. Something closer to uncertainty. I held his gaze for a moment, then gave him the same small, composed smile I had offered at the beginning of the evening. The kind that reveals nothing. The kind that waits. Because by the time this night was over, the question would not be whether I belonged at that table. The question would be whether they understood what they had just tried to move. The envelope remained beneath my hands, but the room had already begun to shift around it in ways most people would not notice. The laughter was still there, the soft music still filled the space, but the rhythm had changed. It happens quietly, almost imperceptibly, when certainty begins to loosen. Conversations pause half a second longer. Smiles do not land quite the same way. Eyes start to move, searching for something they cannot yet name. I had seen it before, in rooms where decisions were made behind closed doors and then presented as if they had always been inevitable. The difference tonight was that I was no longer being managed. I was observing. Across the room, Sophia's movements had become more precise. She was no longer drifting naturally between guests. She was directing herself, recalibrating, adjusting her position in response to something she could feel but not fully identify. Her gaze found this table again, more directly this time, and when it did, she did not look away immediately. That was new. Daniel followed her line of sight again, slower now, his expression less certain with each passing moment. He leaned toward her, saying something under his breath, but she only gave a small shake of her head, her smile returning just quickly enough to maintain the illusion of control. Illusions require constant maintenance. That is their weakness. I let my fingers rest lightly on the envelope, then lifted them just enough to slide it forward an inch across the table. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but it was visible. Margaret noticed first. Her breath caught softly, not in fear, but in recognition of what that movement meant. Howard did not react at all. He never did. That, too, was part of his strength. I did not open the envelope yet. Instead, I turned it slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table the way I had aligned everything else tonight. Precision matters when you are preparing to change something. A server approached again, this time with a quiet confidence that had not been there earlier. "Ma'am," he said gently, "the manager asked me to check if you needed anything at all." I looked up at him, studying the shift in his posture, the subtle difference in how he addressed me. "Please thank him," I said calmly. "I will let him know if I do." He nodded, his expression respectful now, then stepped away. Margaret's eyes followed him, then returned to me. "That is different," she whispered. I inclined my head slightly. "Yes," I said. "It is. Because recognition does not always arrive with an announcement. Sometimes it moves quietly, from one person to another, until the room itself begins to understand something has changed." At the front of the room, Sophia was speaking again, introducing the final portion of the evening, her voice still steady, but the edges of it slightly tighter now, as though she was holding something in place. Daniel stood beside her, but he was no longer entirely present in her moment. His attention kept returning here, to this table, to the space where something had begun to shift without his permission. I reached for the envelope again, this time lifting it fully into my hands. The paper felt exactly as I expected. Firm. Certain. Uncompromising. I ran my thumb lightly along the edge, then placed it back down, but not where it had been before. This time, I set it directly in front of me, in clear view, no longer hidden, no longer incidental. Across the room, Sophia saw it. I watched the exact moment her expression changed, just slightly, just enough. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. And awareness is where everything begins. I folded my hands neatly on either side of the envelope, framing it without touching it again. The music continued. The guests listened. The evening moved forward exactly as planned. But underneath it, something else had taken hold, something that did not belong to the program, something that could not be smoothed over or redirected. I allowed myself a slow, measured breath, my posture steady, my expression unchanged. They had arranged every detail of this night to place me at the edge of the story. What they had not understood was that the story had never belonged to them in the first place. And when the moment came, it would not be loud. It would not be dramatic. It would simply be undeniable. I waited until the room settled into its final rhythm before I moved again. It always happens toward the end of an evening like this. The energy softens, conversations grow quieter, and people begin to gather their impressions of what they believe they have witnessed. That is when the truth has the most space to breathe. I lifted my hands from the table slowly, leaving the envelope exactly where it was, centered, visible, impossible to ignore now for anyone who chose to look closely enough. Across the room, Sophia had stopped speaking mid-sentence for just a fraction of a second before continuing, her composure returning quickly, but not seamlessly. Daniel noticed. I saw it in the way he turned toward her, his attention no longer divided, but unsettled. I rose from my chair without drawing attention, smoothing the front of my dress as I stood. The movement was quiet, measured, but it carried. Margaret's eyes followed me immediately. Howard remained seated, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment without ever needing to say so. I picked up the envelope, holding it lightly in both hands, then stepped away from the table. The distance between me and the center of the room felt longer than it had earlier in the evening, not because it had changed, but because I understood it differently now. People noticed. They always do when something breaks from the pattern they have grown comfortable with. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But enough. When I reached the space near the front of the room, I did not interrupt. I simply waited. That is another thing I learned over time. Silence, held at the right moment, becomes its own invitation. Sophia saw me first. Of course she did. Her smile held for a second longer than necessary before settling into something more controlled. "Evelyn," she said, her voice warm enough to pass, though the edge beneath it had sharpened. "Did you need something?" I met her gaze, calm, steady, the same way I had all evening. "Just a moment," I said gently. Daniel turned fully toward me now, his expression uncertain, searching for context that had not been given to him. The room quieted further, the music continuing in the background, but no longer the focus. I placed the envelope on the small table beside them, not handing it over, not explaining it, simply setting it down where it could not be ignored. "I thought it might be appropriate," I said, my voice even, "to bring this to your attention before the evening ends." Sophia's eyes moved to the envelope, then back to me, calculating, measuring, adjusting. "What is it?" she asked, her tone light, but no longer effortless. I allowed a small pause before answering, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle into the room. "Clarity," I said. Daniel stepped closer, his hand hovering briefly near the envelope before pulling back, as though he was not yet certain he had the right to touch it. "Mom," he began, the word unfamiliar on his tongue tonight, softer than it had been earlier, uncertain in a way that had not been there before. I looked at him then, fully, holding his gaze with a steadiness that did not waver. "You should read it," I said quietly. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The room was already listening. Sophia reached for the envelope first, her movements controlled, precise, as if she could maintain authority simply by touching it. But authority does not come from possession. It comes from understanding. And as she opened it, carefully, deliberately, I watched the exact moment that understanding began to shift. I did not need to see the document again. I already knew what it contained. I had known from the moment Howard placed it beside me. I stepped back slightly, creating space, not retreating, but allowing the moment to unfold without interference. The room held its breath in that quiet, subtle way that only happens when something irreversible is about to reveal itself. I folded my hands gently in front of me, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. They had spent the entire evening defining my place with a single card, a single word, a single quiet decision made without me. Temporary. I let that word settle one last time in my mind, then allowed it to fall away completely. Because as Sophia's eyes moved across the page, as Daniel leaned closer, trying to understand what she was seeing, the truth did not need to be announced. It simply existed. And for the first time that night, it was not me who had to explain anything.